Something strange is happening in Washington, and the silence is deafening. While Jamaica spends $5 billion reshaping Caribbean aviation infrastructure, while European airlines rush to establish new routes, while Asian investors pour capital into Montego Bay developments, the United States government has said virtually nothing. Not a press conference, not a congressional hearing, not even a strongly worded State Department memo. The most powerful nation on Earth is watching a dramatic shift in regional aviation dynamics unfold 90 miles from Florida, and the official response has been absolute radio silence. This isn't normal. When Panama expanded its canal, American officials gave speeches. When Cuba opened to tourism, Congress held debates. When Chinese companies started building ports across the Caribbean, the Pentagon issued warnings. But Jamaica's unprecedented airport expansion, a project that could fundamentally alter how 50 million Americans travel to the Caribbean annually, has generated almost zero attention from U.S. policymakers, mainstream media, or aviation industry leaders. The question isn't whether Jamaica's expansion matters. The numbers prove it does. The question is why America seems determined to ignore it. And the possible answers range from bureaucratic oversight to calculated strategy to something far more concerning, a fundamental misunderstanding of how quickly the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere is changing. Let's start with the media silence, because it reveals something profound about American attention patterns. In the past 18 months, as Jamaica has broken ground on billions of dollars in aviation infrastructure, major U.S. news networks have published exactly zero in-depth investigations into the strategic implications. CNN hasn't run a single primetime segment analyzing what Jamaica's expansion means for Miami International Airport. Fox News hasn't hosted debates about Caribbean aviation competition. MSNBC hasn't questioned whether American tourism dominance is under threat. Compare that to the media coverage given to far less significant infrastructure projects. When Dubai announced expansions to its already massive airport, American business networks provided weeks of analysis. When Singapore upgraded Changi Airport, aviation journalists wrote dozens of articles examining competitive implications. When Beijing opened its new Daxing International Airport, U.S. media treated it as a major geopolitical development worthy of extensive commentary. But Jamaica, an island nation 90 miles from Florida spending $5 billion to triple its aviation capacity, barely a mention outside specialized aviation trade publications that most Americans will never read. The New York Times published one short article buried in the travel section. The Wall Street Journal ran a brief Business Wire story that generated zero follow-up analysis. USA Today mentioned it in a roundup of Caribbean tourism trends alongside cruise ship schedules and hotel openings. This media indifference becomes even more puzzling when you consider the scale of American economic interests at stake. Over 12 million Americans visit the Caribbean annually, spending approximately $30 billion on transportation, accommodations, and activities. Miami International Airport processes over 8 million Caribbean-bound passengers each year, generating hundreds of millions in landing fees, concession revenues, and local economic activity. American Airlines, Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest have collectively invested billions in Caribbean route networks that depend on current hub-and-spoke systems centered on U.S. gateway cities. Jamaica's expansion threatens all of that. Every direct flight to Montego Bay eliminates a connection through Miami. Every cargo shipment routed through Kingston means lost revenue for Atlanta. Every tourist who flies straight to Negril instead of changing planes in Fort Lauderdale represents income that never touches American soil. Yet the media outlets that typically sound alarms about foreign economic competition have treated Jamaica's aviation strategy as barely newsworthy. The governmental silence is equally striking. The State Department, which regularly comments on infrastructure developments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, has issued no official statements about Jamaica's airport expansion, no press releases analyzing regional implications, no briefings for congressional committees examining Caribbean policy, no public diplomacy efforts explaining how this fits into broader U.S.-Caribbean relations. The Department of Commerce, which monitors foreign investments that could impact American economic interests, appears to have conducted no formal assessment of how Jamaica's aviation expansion might affect U.S. tourism revenues or airline profitability. The Department of Transportation, responsible for negotiating international aviation agreements and protecting American carrier interests, has published no reports examining whether Jamaica's new capabilities require adjustments to existing bilateral aviation treaties. Even more revealing, congressional oversight has been non-existent. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which regularly holds hearings on aviation competitiveness and infrastructure investment, hasn't scheduled a single session to examine Caribbean aviation dynamics. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which monitors developments throughout the Western Hemisphere, hasn't called witnesses to testify about Jamaica's strategic positioning. The various caucuses focused on tourism, travel, and economic competitiveness have remained silent. This governmental indifference stands in stark contrast to how American officials typically respond to infrastructure developments in the Caribbean basin. When Chinese companies began building ports in the Bahamas, Panama, and Jamaica itself, congressional committees held multiple hearings questioning security implications. When Venezuelan influence expanded in several Eastern Caribbean nations, the State Department issued concerned statements about regional stability. When Cuban tourism began recovering after diplomatic normalization, American travel industry representatives lobbied aggressively for policy changes to protect their competitive position. But Jamaica building 3 world-class airports capable of handling wide-body international aircraft. Nothing. Not even background briefings for journalists or think tank analysts who might raise questions about long-term implications. The private sector silence adds another layer to the mystery. Major American airlines that stand to lose significant market share have made no public comments about Jamaica's expansion. American Airlines, which dominates Caribbean routes from Miami, hasn't warned investors about potential competitive pressures. Delta, which hubs Caribbean traffic through Atlanta, hasn't adjusted its strategic planning documents to account for direct competition from Montego Bay or Kingston. JetBlue, which built much of its business model around connecting passengers through Fort Lauderdale and New York to Caribbean destinations, hasn't acknowledged that Jamaica's new capabilities could undermine its network advantages. Airport authorities in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Atlanta have similarly remained quiet. These organizations typically monitor competitive threats obsessively, publishing detailed analyses of rival airports and lobbying aggressively to protect their market positions. Yet none have issued public assessments of Jamaica's expansion or proposed countermeasures to maintain their Caribbean gateway status. Hotel chains and resort developers, many headquartered in the United States, have made no public statements about how improved aviation access to Jamaica might shift investment patterns across the Caribbean. Tourism boards in competing destinations like the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands haven't launched campaigns highlighting their advantages over Jamaica or warning about losing market share to a better connected competitor. This private sector silence is particularly puzzling because corporate America usually responds aggressively to competitive threats. When European airlines expanded transatlantic service, U.S. carriers fought back with new routes and fare wars. When Middle Eastern airlines built connecting hubs that threatened traditional American gateway dominance, U.S. aviation executives lobbied for government intervention and launched public relations campaigns questioning foreign subsidies. When Asian airports upgraded facilities to compete for connecting traffic, American airport authorities accelerated their own modernization programs. But Jamaica's expansion, which threatens to redirect billions in tourism spending and millions in aviation revenues away from American companies, has generated no visible competitive response whatsoever. So what explains this comprehensive silence? The theories range from mundane to alarming, and understanding which explanation is correct has significant implications for how we interpret America's broader strategic position in the Caribbean and beyond. The first theory is simple distraction. American policymakers, media organizations, and business leaders are overwhelmed by domestic concerns that seem more immediate and pressing. Political polarization consumes government attention. Economic uncertainty dominates business planning. Cultural conflicts fill media coverage. In this environment, Caribbean aviation infrastructure barely registers as worth noticing, let alone analyzing in depth. This distraction theory has merit. The past several years have seen unprecedented domestic turmoil in American politics, economics, and society. COVID recovery, inflation concerns, political investigations, social movements, and technological disruptions have created an environment where even significant international developments struggle to break through the noise. Jamaica's airport expansion, regardless of its long-term strategic importance, simply can't compete for attention with more immediate crises. Supporting this theory, we can observe that American media and governmental attention to virtually all international infrastructure developments has declined significantly. Coverage of European infrastructure projects is down. Analysis of Asian development initiatives has diminished. Even major developments in traditional areas of American concern, like Middle Eastern energy infrastructure, receive less attention than they would have received a decade ago. Jamaica's expansion isn't being singled out for neglect. It's just one more international development that fails to penetrate America's increasingly inward-focused attention span. The second theory is more concerning: underestimation. American officials, business leaders, and media organizations may be aware of Jamaica's expansion, but simply don't believe it matters. They see a small Caribbean island spending money on airports and assume it's just another minor tourism upgrade that poses no real competitive threat to established American aviation dominance. This perspective treats Jamaica's $5 billion investment as irrelevant rather than invisible, which would represent a significant strategic miscalculation. Evidence for this theory can be found in how American analysts typically discuss Caribbean tourism and aviation. Industry reports often treat the entire Caribbean as a single market, rather than a collection of competing destinations with different capabilities and strategies. Infrastructure developments in smaller nations are frequently dismissed as unlikely to challenge established patterns. American companies operating in the region often display assumptions of permanent dominance that ignore how quickly competitive dynamics can shift when capabilities change dramatically. If underestimation explains the silence, it suggests a dangerous complacency in American strategic thinking. History provides numerous examples of established powers dismissing emerging competitors until it's too late to respond effectively. British officials underestimated American industrial growth in the late 19th century. American automakers underestimated Japanese quality improvements in the 1970s. Traditional retailers underestimated e-commerce disruption in the early 2000s. In each case, the dominant players assumed their advantages were permanent and failed to recognize that new capabilities could fundamentally alter competitive landscapes. Jamaica's airport expansion could represent exactly this kind of transformative capability shift. 3 modern airports with extended runways, advanced technology, and strategic positioning could genuinely redirect tourism and cargo flows in ways that permanently reduce American aviation revenues and influence. If U.S. officials and business leaders are dismissing this possibility because Jamaica seems too small to matter, they may be making a classic strategic error with billion-dollar consequences. The third theory is more complex and potentially more troubling: calculated neglect. Under this interpretation, American officials fully understand Jamaica's strategic positioning, but have concluded that public attention would be counterproductive. Perhaps they believe that highlighting competitive threats would only accelerate Jamaica's momentum by generating free publicity. Perhaps they worry that official concern would be interpreted as American bullying of a smaller neighbor. Perhaps they're pursuing quiet diplomatic or economic strategies to influence Jamaica's approach without drawing public attention to the situation. This theory finds some support in how the United States has historically managed Caribbean relationships. American policy in the region often operates through subtle influence rather than dramatic public interventions. Economic leverage, diplomatic pressure, and private sector partnerships allow the U.S. to shape regional developments without generating the kind of attention that might trigger nationalist backlash or international criticism. If calculated neglect explains the silence, it suggests American officials believe they can manage Jamaica's expansion through channels that don't require public acknowledgement. Perhaps they're working through international financial institutions to ensure Jamaica's airport debt remains manageable, creating future leverage. Perhaps they're encouraging American Airlines to secure long-term agreements that protect their market positions regardless of infrastructure improvements. Perhaps they're positioning U.S. companies to benefit from Jamaica's growth rather than competing against it. However, calculated neglect carries significant risks. If the strategy fails, the lack of public preparation means no groundwork has been laid for more aggressive responses. If Jamaica's expansion succeeds in redirecting substantial revenue away from American companies and airports, the absence of prior warning to affected constituencies will make adjustment more difficult and politically contentious. The fourth theory introduces geopolitical complexity, strategic repositioning. Perhaps American silence reflects a broader recalculation of Caribbean priorities driven by global competition with China and other powers. In this interpretation, U.S. officials have concluded that maintaining absolutely dominant aviation position in the Caribbean is less important than ensuring the region doesn't fall under Chinese economic influence. Jamaica's airport expansion, largely financed through traditional Western financial channels and partnerships, might be viewed as preferable to alternatives involving Chinese infrastructure investment. This theory aligns with observable patterns in broader U.S. Caribbean policy. As Chinese companies have increased investment throughout the region, including infrastructure projects in Jamaica itself, American officials have faced difficult choices about how to respond. Directly opposing infrastructure development risks pushing Caribbean nations toward greater Chinese partnerships. Supporting regional development through traditional Western channels, even when it creates competitive pressures for American companies, might be seen as the lesser evil. Jamaica's airport expansion includes substantial European and Canadian participation, alongside local Jamaican investment. From a geopolitical perspective, this represents Western capital and expertise strengthening Caribbean infrastructure. If the alternative was Chinese companies building the same airports with Chinese equipment and Chinese financing, American officials might prefer the current arrangement despite its competitive implications for U.S. aviation interests. This strategic repositioning theory suggests American silence reflects a conscious decision to prioritize geopolitical stability over narrow economic interests in specific sectors. It would represent sophisticated strategic thinking that accepts short-term competitive pressures in aviation to achieve longer-term goals of maintaining Western influence in the Caribbean basin. The fifth theory is perhaps most alarming: institutional failure. American government and business institutions designed for an era of unchallenged dominance may simply lack the mechanisms to identify and respond to this type of competitive development. The silence isn't strategic or calculated. It's symptomatic of organizations that have become complacent, bureaucratic, and unable to recognize threats that don't fit established patterns. Evidence for institutional failure can be found throughout American responses to international competition in recent decades. U.S. officials failed to anticipate how quickly Chinese manufacturing capabilities would grow. American companies were slow to recognize how emerging market innovations would challenge established business models. Government agencies designed to monitor traditional security threats have struggled to adapt to economic and technological competitions. If institutional failure explains the silence around Jamaica's expansion, it suggests deeper problems in how America identifies and responds to international developments. Organizations become complacent when success is taken for granted. Bureaucracies develop blind spots that prevent them from seeing threats outside their established categories. Industries dominated by a few large players lose the competitive urgency that drives innovation and strategic adaptation. Under this theory, no one in government or business is deliberately ignoring Jamaica's expansion. Instead, the information exists, but fails to trigger institutional responses, because the systems designed to process international developments aren't configured to recognize Caribbean infrastructure as strategically significant. The intelligence reaches analysts but doesn't reach decision makers. Business executives receive reports but don't adjust strategies. Media organizations publish brief stories but don't assign investigative resources. Each theory has implications for what America's silence means and how the situation might evolve. If distraction explains the silence, attention could shift rapidly once domestic concerns ease or Jamaica's impact becomes impossible to ignore. If underestimation is the cause, recognition might come too late for effective competitive response. If calculated neglect is the strategy, events may unfold according to American plans we simply can't observe. If strategic repositioning drives the silence, U.S. officials may be playing a longer game than critics recognize. If institutional failure is the problem, America's competitive position may erode across multiple domains before systems adapt. The reality probably involves elements of all five theories working simultaneously. Different governmental departments might be silent for different reasons. Media organizations might be distracted, while business executives are underestimating Jamaica's potential. Strategic thinkers might be calculating quiet responses, while institutional systems fail to process information effectively. What makes this situation particularly significant is its timing. Jamaica's expansion is occurring during a broader moment of flux in global aviation, Caribbean geopolitics, and American international engagement. The post-pandemic recovery has scrambled established patterns. Climate change is forcing reconsideration of sustainable tourism models. Technology is enabling new forms of connectivity that challenge traditional hub-and-spoke systems. Geopolitical competition is intensifying throughout the Western Hemisphere. In this context, Jamaica's airport expansion isn't just about concrete and steel. It's about positioning for an uncertain future where current advantages might not persist and new capabilities could rapidly alter competitive landscapes. The nation that moves first to build future-ready infrastructure gains advantages that compound over time. American silence, regardless of its explanation, means the United States is ceding first-mover advantage in Caribbean aviation infrastructure. While Jamaica builds, American airports maintain facilities designed for past rather than future needs. While Jamaica negotiates new airline partnerships, American carriers operate under assumption that existing route structures remain optimal. While Jamaica positions itself as a 21st century hub, American companies and officials act as though 20th century patterns will continue indefinitely. The consequences of this silence could manifest in several ways. Most obviously, American aviation companies and airports could lose substantial revenue as direct flights increasingly bypass U.S. gateway cities. Less obviously, but potentially more significant, America's broader influence in the Caribbean could diminish as Jamaica's enhanced connectivity makes it a more natural center for regional business, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. When professionals throughout the Caribbean can fly directly to Kingston for meetings rather than connecting through Miami, business relationships shift. When European tourists can reach Negril without transiting through Atlanta, spending patterns change. When cargo can flow efficiently through Montego Bay instead of routing through Fort Lauderdale, supply chains reorganize. Each individual shift seems minor, but collectively, they represent a fundamental reorientation of Caribbean connectivity patterns away from American hubs. The question now is whether American silence will persist, or whether Jamaica's continued progress will eventually trigger recognition and response. The answer depends partly on which theory best explains current silence and partly on how events unfold. If Jamaica's passenger numbers surge dramatically, media attention might finally materialize. If American Airlines report significant revenue declines attributable to direct Caribbean competition, business responses might emerge. If geopolitical analysts begin flagging Caribbean connectivity as a strategic concern, governmental attention might focus. Alternatively, silence might persist until Jamaica's new capabilities are firmly established and competitive responses become far more difficult and expensive. By the time American officials, business leaders, and media organizations fully recognize what has occurred, Jamaica might occupy a position in Caribbean aviation that proves extremely difficult to challenge. The ultimate irony is that American silence, intended or not, might be Jamaica's greatest advantage. Every month that passes without competitive response allows Jamaica to secure airline agreements, develop operational expertise, and establish market position. Every year of inattention gives Jamaica time to prove its capabilities and build customer loyalty. If America eventually responds with competitive airport upgrades or aggressive airline strategies, Jamaica will face those challenges from a position of established strength rather than aspirational planning. So America remains silent while Jamaica builds, and that silence speaks volumes about how international competition operates in the 21st century. The nation that fails to notice shifting competitive dynamics, regardless of the reason, concedes advantages that might prove difficult to recover. The question isn't whether Jamaica's expansion matters. The question is whether America will recognize it matters before the opportunity to respond effectively has passed.